if we're serious about capitalizing on things like critical minerals and natural resources, there better be a place for those people to live. And so housing in the north really needs to be a focus for all of our policies.
Through the provincial and federal elections earlier this year, the housing crisis often took a backseat to the issues of tariffs and trade. Yet, in this time of economic uncertainty, building housing has become even more complicated. How can stakeholders work together to find a path forward? I'm now going to introduce our panelists, and I'll ask you just to hold your applause until we're all done. Today, we are joined by Scott Andison, CEO of the Ontario Home Builders Association, Michael Fedchyshyn, CEO of the Building Ontario Fund, and Laura Mirabella, Commissioner of Finance and Treasurer for the Regional Municipality of York. Please give them a hand. Let's just set things up for our audience. Most people in the audience, in this audience most of all, know how this works. But for those at home who are watching and wondering why we are not seeing more housing getting built, who are the key players in getting a home built?
It requires multiple players here. We heard the Premier say yesterday that it's not governments that build homes, it's the private sector builders that build homes. So we need an environment that allows builders to flourish, to be able to target their capital into Ontario so that we can get more homes built. But we need municipalities, we need the provincial and federal levels of government to create that environment that allows builders to build homes at a cost that families can afford. And right now we talk about a housing crisis, we need a crisis-led response. We need an environment that allows builders to be able to build homes that families can qualify to a mortgage and be able to afford to build. But most importantly, we need to figure out what we need to change on all three of those levels to be able to make this happen.
And Michael, what's the role of the Build Ontario Fund in financing homes?
Yeah, so the Building Ontario Fund, we have a vertical for affordable housing, and our role there is to be catalytic in financing projects that don't quite get across the line. And so we're not a granting agency, but we are semi-concessional financing. And what we've been looking at in that space is really innovative models for delivering housing that structurally reduce the cost of housing and bring affordability into reach.
Now, Scott, I think anybody who's seen the headlines recently knows that housing starts are not where we want them to be. They have been trending down. They keep going down. It's kind of alarming. Are builders still incentivized to build new homes when we've got the prices of new homes coming down, even as we know that costs are going up?
So if you look back in 2021, housing starts were about 100,000. It was one of the highest amounts that we've ever seen in Ontario. Fast forward to 2024, they're down to 70,000. Right now in 2025, we're forecasting about 28 to 30,000. That is not going in the right direction. It's certainly not what the government has been forecasting. It's certainly not what the government wants. But that's housing starts. When you look at what really indicates what the market conditions are is actual sales of new houses. When we look back, again, 2021, we had about 40,000 new home sales in that year. We look just into last year, we're sitting at about the 9,800 mark. Again, not in the right trend, more than 70% drop. We are forecasting only about 28 to 30,000 new homes starts for this year. This is not going to be filling the gap. It's not filling the need. We have governments asking us, why are builders not building? And it really gets to the point of they can build them. Nobody can afford to buy them. So if you have an average build home price right now of north of $1 million and people can qualify, families can qualify, particularly new first-time home buyers, for less than $800,000. That gap is just not being met. And builders are sitting with an inventory right now of about 27,000 homes across the province between single-family towns and condos. Nobody can afford to buy those. So the idea of putting more money into building new homes now just doesn't make sense. And what we have realized over the last couple of years, and we'll talk about some of the things that we've done most recently to be a little bit more innovative to solve this, but what government needs to understand, and we've been hopefully successful in educating them on, capital is agnostic. If they can't figure out how to invest capital here, developers will take that money elsewhere and it never comes back.
So let's bring government in. Laura, from your perspective, what is the biggest obstacle from building more housing right now?
So I think Scott has spoken to some of the issues. Costs have gone up for builders, and I think municipalities understand that. One of the other barriers, though, for municipalities to participate in the process is we need to build infrastructure, and those costs have impacted us as well. In the last several years, there's been some uncertainty around how we can pay for that infrastructure. We've seen senior governments come to the table with some infrastructure funding for local municipalities and single-tier municipalities. Regions have not been able to access any of that. And regions build a lot of the housing enabling infrastructure that needs to be put in place to service those lots so that the builders can build.
A few years back, the province removed some of the planning responsibilities from the regions, downloaded that to local municipalities. Can you give me some sense of how that has affected, specifically on the housing file? Like, has it made it harder to plan for that housing enabling infrastructure?
I think what it's done is it's required regions and their local municipalities to communicate better. Local municipalities and local municipal councils have the accountability and the responsibility to plan their communities. And then they work with us very collaboratively to make sure that we understand what the infrastructure needs are. I would say that in many regions that was already happening quite successfully, a collaborative process to plan. This has just crystallized the need to do that much better.
Michael, I'll ask you the same question. I mean, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to getting more housing built now?
I think you have to start with the ideological one of, do you actually want the housing in the first place? And that sounds a bit maybe trite as a comment, but the structural, the financial, the procedural issues that impair the ability to deliver housing are all imminently solvable. Building Ontario Fund can solve some of the financial problems, but only if there's a real concerted desire and effort to build housing and build it at scale. To the previous comments, we're in record low completion territory, and the fundamental economics of housing are broken, or at the very least unfavorable. That didn't just happen overnight. That's been a problem evolving over many decades, but it's fundamentally rooted in the core desire to build housing in the first place. And once you've got over that ideological hurdle and the citizens of a given community want that housing, then the rest can be solved.
Scott, finally, the same question to you. I mean, what do you see as the biggest obstacles?
The biggest obstacles for us when I sit down and talk to our builder members and say, like, what is the biggest barrier for you? They come back with a few things, which is really what led to some of the innovative things we're doing now. One was they said, when we're building in multiple jurisdictions, so if I'm in this town, this city, this region, it's a completely different application process in each to be able to get your site plan approval, which means they have to retool how they do their applications, how they do their calculations, and they're also looking at very different fee models across the different jurisdictions. So that was one thing, and you know, we worked jointly with AMO. We had chair of OHBA's board, Mike Memmi, sign a letter with AMO's president, Robin Jones, to be able to put forward in the province, and that shocked the hell out of the province. Because it's like, wait a minute, builders, municipalities asking for the same thing. It was like a little bit of a reality check for them. And so that actually got their attention. So they started realizing we need to look at this a little bit differently, and they tried to get into really what some of the fundamental problems were. So when we sat down with AMO representatives, in fact, the very first time I sat down with Laura, she had one question for me. She said, what is your position as OHBA on development charges? Is it your position that we need to completely wipe out development charges? And my response was absolutely not. What we need to do is figure out better ways to fund some of the critical infrastructure like water and sewer. Well, she went from a very placid looking face to a little bit of a smile saying, okay, we can continue this conversation, which has been great. Over the last several months, we have done a lot of work. We have put together a plan, a proposal that said, look, we need to make these changes. And out of that came Bill 17. Minister Flack, I think, has won the record on how quickly he turned around legislation as being a brand new cabinet minister. But we have this piece of legislation working through collaboratively with AMO right now, alongside the builders, to figure out what these regs look like. And for the first time, and this is part of that education component, is that government is now seeing the home construction industry as a as a system, rather than a series of component parts. This is, when I look back and look at what was wrong with all the previous pieces of legislation over the last 4 or 5 years, is they only looked at one piece, they tinkered with it, and then thought, okay, we fixed it, right? And the answer to that is no. So Bill 17 is much more fundamental, more systems aligned in its thinking, and we're much more optimistic that we're going to be able to help municipalities attract the infrastructure funding that they need, and builders to have an environment that actually makes them put shovels in the ground.
Laura, I mean, Bill 17 is an interesting case because I think if you go back a few years, it has not always been a not chaotic relationship with the province. There's been a lot of changes that they've introduced. Sometimes they push a really big change forward. Sometimes they roll it back a bit. And from your perspective, I'm wondering, do you see, I was reading the Strategy Corp survey with CAOs yesterday, and it described a stabilizing relationship with the province. I'm wondering if you see Bill 17 as an example of things maybe stabilizing for a bit after what has been sometimes a pretty rocky few years in terms of the government's housing policy.
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is. Lindsay, in her remarks earlier, alluded to the fact that there's been a number of pieces of legislation. I've actually lost count. I think it was 7 or 8 since 2018. That have impacted how municipalities raise the money to pay for infrastructure in some very significant ways, with Bill 23 being a real rupture point. And it did get rocky between municipalities and the industry, but guess what? That doesn't help get housing built. That actually brings things to a standstill. And so it was really important for, I think, municipalities, for AMO, for Scott at OHBA, for us to sit down and realize that actually we all have the same goals. Municipalities are there to build their community, and that includes building housing and bringing more people into their communities. Municipal staff want to be able to serve their councils in a way that is fiscally sustainable, and the sector wants to be able to build and run their businesses. We agree on many more things than we disagree on. And Bill 17, I think, is a real turning point that we've been able to go to the province jointly with some recommendations. And through this regulatory process, continuing to work together to hammer out the details of how that will be implemented.
I want to turn now to maybe the economic story of the year, American tariffs and all of the economic disruption that has caused. How does the economic uncertainty from the trade war and speaking of a rocky relationship, not knowing what the level of tariffs from U.S. Exports or imports is going to be on any given day, what does that do for the building sector? And maybe, Michael, I'll start with you. Does this affect the financial side as well?
It certainly does. There's a baseline murmur of uncertainty, not just around things like cost to construct and how the tariffs might impact building materials and so on, but just general economic climate and growth. And I'd layer on with that just questions around what immigration policy will look like as well, which has been key to driving housing growth in the province. So yeah, there's a baseline uncertainty in the market that is not helpful. Is one of the many factors, to Scott's point, that have impaired housing starts and just confidence in the market that existed previously. So certainly it's in the financial markets. lenders stuck in assets that are challenged, condos and office space and otherwise, and certainly even in industrials, which are a very strong sector in the province. A year or 2 years ago, a chill even there, where due to the ongoing discussions between the U.S. and Canada. So it's certainly a chill.
And Scott, what are you seeing from builders in terms of the economic uncertainty?
So I think there's two parts of this. So first off, the tariffs themselves certainly impacting on the supply chain, impacting the cost to, John, to your point, like not knowing day to day what that cost is going to be. So they're having to figure out, do I lock in this cost now with this one supplier? Could it be better or worse a week from now? So they're working that out. And builders are pretty innovative. They're smart business people. So they are looking and figuring out, how do I alter my supply chain? Where else can I get this from? And they work together, they collaborate, and a lot of information sharing. So that's the one side on the cost. But the bigger part of it is really on what it's doing to the consumer base. So whenever there is some type of uncertainty in the market, whether it be tariffs or anything else, the approach to purchasing big ticket items certainly diminished significantly. If you're uncertain about the future of your job, you're not going to go out and buy a home. You're not going to buy a big ticket car. You're not going to take big luxurious vacations. So that impacts that. They're sitting and waiting to see what happens. But on top of that, you compound it. And again, governments have always the best of intentions, but sometimes you have to wonder whether they realize when they muse about things like going into an election, and here's all the things I'm going to promise. Federally, they promised they were going to exempt the HST off of first-time buyers on new home sales. So they put that in their platform, they get elected, they talk about they're going to implement it, and then there's no new details. So what do you do as a consumer? I'm going to wait to see if I can get that 5% off of, or 13% in Ontario off of the cost of a new home. So I'm just going to chill. I'm going to wait before I go and look for houses. What does that do for builders? They've got inventory. We've got about 27,000 units sitting in inventory across the province right now. We've got another 20 to 30,000 that are, in some process of completion. Guess what? They're slowing all of those down, which means skilled trades who used to work 5 days a week are now working 2 to 3 days a week. So they're slowing that down. It's having significant impacts on the economy, and builders are having to sit and think, what am I going to do? What does my future look like? So when governments muse about this, and then the Premier goes out and says, whatever the federal government does, we will match. Great, what's the federal government gonna do? We're still waiting. And what we have been saying to the province is, this is a great opportunity for Ontario to lead again from the front. We've seen our Premier, who sometimes gets called Captain Canada, out there advocating on behalf of all things that are good to be able to protect Ontario. In fact, they've turned that into their slogan. Yes. So we're hoping that the Premier says, okay, we can't wait for the federal government. We need a stimulus into the home construction industry now. If Ontario were to go out and say, we are exempting the 8% of HST, the provincial portion off of all new home sales, our projection based on the data we've had done by those way smarter than me in the industry have come back and said that's about 40 to 45,000 new units that would just get started. Because all of a sudden, when you knock $50,000 to $75,000 off the cost of a new home that averages about $800,000-900,000 right now, that makes it a significant number of new families that now qualify for a mortgage. And we need the stimulus now because we have about 41,000 skilled trades that are about to lose their job in the next 6 months. And they will never come back to the industry because they'll have no choice but to leave.
I'm just going to be a provincial chauvinist for a moment and say, this is the point of federalism, that the province doesn't actually have to wait for Ottawa to do things. You can just do things. But that said, Laura, I know that certainly through COVID, economic uncertainty really disrupted the City of Toronto's housing plans, the ones that I'm most familiar with just as a journalist. There were affordable housing plans that just have been delayed and not started because the conditions of financing just changed so dramatically. What are you seeing?
So that's right. And in the municipal sector, and I of course can speak mostly about York Region, we know that prior to COVID, we had invested really billions of dollars into water and wastewater infrastructure. We took on a very large amount of debt. We are still carrying about $2 billion related to the investments we made during that time. And there's no market for the homes that would go into those areas. And if we don't collect the development charges related to those homes, we can't recycle that in order to be able to re-leverage and invest in infrastructure in areas where hopefully there could be some growth. And it's really been an issue of the markets shifting away from condos, wanting to move to more ground-related townhouses, single-family homes. And that's going to require many municipalities to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure when there's so much uncertainty around whether people can afford those homes. It's really difficult for municipalities to be able to make those investments on speculation, not knowing when they're going to be able to repay their debt.
And I mean, the question above all of this is that this is all kind of beyond our control, certainly beyond my control. And so how do you, as a municipality, how do you plan for something that is fundamentally out of your hands?
So I think actually the collaboration that we were talking about earlier is the key. At York Region, we've got a really close relationship with our developers, with our local municipalities. We've done a lot of work to study what that inventory is. We've got about 70,000 units that have been of capacity that have been allocated, that we're just waiting for those units to come on stream. And they understand that it's difficult for us to reinvest in more infrastructure. So we're looking at innovative partnerships where we can share some of that timing risk. We've been able to use that quite successfully over the last few years to be able to invest, a few $100 million in new infrastructure in areas where they believed they could build, could sell, and in exchange for they've prepaid their development charges, having confidence that they'll be able to recover that amount as they are able to build much quicker than they otherwise would be able to.
Michael, I mean, I know there are financial instruments that agencies can use to try and hedge their risks and that kind of things. But in this environment of so much uncertainty, how does that? How do you plan for the unplannable?
Well, I'm not sure we're any better at planning the developable areas of municipalities than municipalities are. Actually, I'm quite sure we're not better. I think what we can do, or at least the way we're approaching this at Building Ontario Fund, is we are tying our when we're getting involved in enabling financing, we're tying it to projects that we can see completion ahead. So where the market demand has demonstrated itself as being there, and where those developments have what I'd call a financing timing issue. And so, yes, there's nervousness in the market of are they going to occupy as quickly or are they going to sell as quickly, but we can take some of that risk off the table by dropping the wires and the pipes in the ground, with the anticipation that those sales will eventually come. And that's part of our mandate, and I think it's part of a quite deliberate effort on the part of the province to spur development, creation of things like the Building Ontario Fund or the Housing Enabling Water Systems Fund, really designed to try and take a bit of that risk off the table and deal with some of the issues that you just mentioned.
And if I can just add, municipalities certainly in the last year have really been working with their development communities and coming up with financial incentives, right? Ways in which that they can share timing risk. Even prior to the tabling of Bill 17, my municipality brought forward some options to defer collection of development charges until much later in the process where cash flow would be more secure for developers. We have worked with our developer community to sort of capitalize on this slowdown in ownership housing and try and incent rental housing. In York Region, for example, we have a very low stock of rental. Most of it is secondary market. There's very little purpose-built rental within our overall housing stock. And so we've developed quite a comprehensive incentive program to hopefully keep crews working and add to our housing stock a kind of housing that was really missing from our community.
Actually, I was going to ask about this later, but I'll throw it in now because we're talking about rental. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the numbers, I mean, ownership construction has kind of fallen off a cliff, but the one bright spot here is that rental construction across the country really is picking up very, very quickly. And maybe, Scott, to you, I'll ask, I mean, it is climbing up, but it's climbing up from a very low base that had been like flatlined for many decades. Is there a capacity for rental construction to replace the lost capacity that we're seeing in construction, or is it just not going to be able to close that gap?
I think there's a couple things in play here. So first off, it really comes down to affordability. So if rental housing is more affordable for families because they don't have to raise the down payment, they don't have to deal with all the other costs related to home ownership, and rental provides a pathway that allows them to work that into their income levels, then they're certainly going to go in that direction. And to Laura's point, when you don't have enough rental housing stock in any community, then that pent-up demand just creates havoc within the local community. So what York Region was doing in terms of incentivizing that, it obviously has to match what the builders are seeing in terms of, is there sufficient customer demand for them to do that? Then absolutely they go down that road. And you're absolutely right that this was ignored for far too many decades, and that's why we have such older housing stock on the rental side that is so expensive to maintain. Municipalities trying to, things like in the city of Toronto, their biggest issue is all this old housing, rental stock that is not air conditioned. And again, best of intentions on public policy, but you just can't wave a wand and all of a sudden put HVAC through a 60-year-old building without having to have cost implications for that in a rent-controlled environment. So that's where it makes sense. Families are going to gravitate towards rental. But on the other side of things, we're seeing changes in where that demand is. So because this is, like, builders go through a long-term process with high risk in terms of getting from the time of site plan application through to actually getting a shovel in the ground, through to getting families actually occupying those units. So when they start off and thinking they're going to build a condo building, and then all of a sudden the market is no longer demanding because we can't build it at a price that people can afford to buy, we're seeing a number of our members now converting condo developments going into the rental market. And that's two things. One is they have to enter into being now a landlord, where they were never originally set up to do that. So they're either bringing in management companies to do that, or they're saying, you know what, we're going to have to set up a whole new unit within our company to figure out how we manage this. And they've got all the landlord-tenant board issues and all those other types of regulations that are mostly brand new to them. But they're finding ways to do that because that's where they can get the best return on their capital.
I remember several years ago, when you could start to see the numbers of ownership construction fall off, and I said, oh, well, condo builders are going to have to start being landlords. And I had a whole bunch of people say to me, like, swear up and down that was impossible. It was never going to happen. So I think there's a little bit of, what's the line about,
You
nothing,
were right.
Well, nothing concentrates the mind like being shot at and missed or whatever. Michael, in terms of the financing, I mean, obviously we're seeing some market-driven changes in terms of bringing that rental construction up, but we have also seen some policy changes that have really incentivized rental construction in the last few years, and I'm wondering how you weigh those two factors. Is this primarily being driven by government policy, and could that then be reversed if those policies go away, or are we seeing, is this more fundamental? Is this something that the market is really pushing?
I actually think it's the move to rental is a reaction to two things. One is a conducive policy environment, so programs. This is a place where incentives are actually working to drive building of purpose-built rental. And I think there's probably equal parts necessity and desperation. If one's sitting on a property and has sunk costs in a condo building and it's not economic to build, then necessity tells you better figure out what to do with it. And purpose-built rental is providing an exit path for what might have been the right intention at a time, and now the market conditions have changed. And the fact that the incentives are there to assist with that conversion, and that there's market support for condo builders to move into rental, I think is a great thing, because the rental stock has been aging, and lots of policies preventing rental from being attractive for many decades, and now that's really changed, and I think it's a great thing. I do wonder and worry whether, and I'll kind of maybe point to the City of Toronto, with the number of conversions underway or contemplated, whether or not that puts a downward pressure on rents to the point where those buildings and the economics behind them become challenged. There's certainly nervousness about where rents are going to land. They have been falling, not in all asset classes, but certainly in high rise. And I think there's we can end up in an oversupply of rental scenario just based on how much conversion is happening and given how bad the condo side is, at least in the GTA. But this is a place where I think incentives are working well and policy is working well when combined with a market condition that forces those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about Trump and tariffs, but I think maybe the most salient Canadian policy on housing demand has been the change in immigration policy in the last few years. And, I've certainly seen some people talking about the risks of a housing oversupply coming soon, which, I mean, oh gosh, too many houses, wouldn't that be a problem? I realize that there are actually economic issues, but, in the most recent national election, and certainly you mentioned the Premier's branding in the provincial election, we've really heard a lot about needing a national effort, a wartime effort to build new housing. And Laura, I do want to ask you about the policies we've seen to encourage prefabricated housing, manufactured homes. I know there's some developers in the GTA who really believe that this is a way forward to lower the cost of construction. At the same time, I think anybody who knows the history of the industry, there's also like a pretty well-stocked graveyard of companies that thought that manufactured homes were going to be the thing that would do it. So, what do you see in terms of prefabrication? I mean, do you see this as a path forward for the market?
It's certainly something that I think can be part of the mix. And for York Region, when we think of the continuum of housing, we also are big investors in deeply affordable housing. People who can't access either the private rental market or the private ownership market. And we have a huge backlog. We have more than 18,000 people on our waiting list for community housing in York Region. And prefab or modular housing is something that we are going to take a very close look at. Any dollars that we can save in the construction of our community and social housing can help us build more units, or help our not-for-profit partners in the community build more units, and then taxpayer money gets to go further.
The City of Toronto did some modular supportive housing a few years ago, and I happened to live almost sort of equidistant between two of the projects, and when they were being built, all of the stereotypical things that people scream about, like, oh, it's going to ruin the neighborhood. The neighborhood's fine. I'm just going to put that out there. Scott, the Prime Minister has proposed a new federal, not quite an agency, but Build Canada Homes. It will help build the affordable housing that Laura was talking about. Have we reached a consensus that the government needs to be involved in building particularly the deeply affordable homes? You rolled your eyes slightly there.
Well, it's kind of hard to comment about it in detail because there really aren't any details that have been released about this. I have a very declared bias. Whenever the government shows up and says we're here to help even more, I have a little bit of reservation about, I know they have the best of intentions. I don't think governments are ever been accused of being too market savvy in terms of looking at some of these things. So it's about, to Laura's point, what we talked about earlier about that collaboration, the sharing of information, and I'll talk a little bit later maybe about just the lack of information that we all have as partners in this trying to move forward. But when government talks about we're going to put more things in place to be able to help the private sector do what it does best, we haven't seen a lot of evidence where that has worked well. We look at what the Ontario government says, and as recent as yesterday, Minister Flack saying, we need to get out of your way to let you do what you do well. Our job is to create the environment that allows private sector development to flourish. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt to a point at the federal level in terms of what they may be doing, but when they first came out with their election platform, it was even more convoluted. It actually sounded like they were going to fulfill the role of a developer. They were actually going to do what private sector traditionally has done and done well, and so therefore we were a little bit more skeptical at that point. They've since seemed to roll that back a little bit, pull back on some of those statements, but we're still not quite sure what's there. For us, we need something really, really simple. We need them to understand what our issues are, and we need to help them clear the way so that we can move forward.
Michael, I understand that Build Ontario Fund isn't directly financing like these sort of deeply affordable homes, if I've got that correctly. So how do you see your role in terms of creating the conditions for affordability?
Yeah, so we very much subscribe to the housing continuum view of affordability and accessibility. And our, Building Ontario Fund, not designed to be a mass scalable system for making affordability across the province. We're just not capitalized that way, and we're not set up that way. What we are set up to do, though, is take strategic, focused risk and investment across that spectrum to try and prove out or enable innovative models that help people transition from deeply affordable units where, frankly, will always require government subsidy. They're not investable, they're not economic in and of themselves. But as you go across the spectrum, we talk about getting people into rental homes, then what's the solution to get them out into owned homes and move them up the spectrum? And low barrier to entry ownership, for example, co-ownership scenarios, owned housing on leased land. These are all solutions for some people, not for everybody, but having the choice across that spectrum of, as a citizen, to be able to access housing that's got low barrier to entry or low accessibility barriers is how we view our role in proving those models out where they're a little bit unconventional for the market. And so you'll see us looking at delivery models for housing that have a bit of special sauce to them, things like co-living. I mentioned co-investment and leased land as other examples. And we're very, very interested in factory-produced housing. I'll not say modular, I think that has a different connotation, but across that spectrum, there are companies in Ontario today that have capacity to build high-quality, mid and high-rise, whether it's panelized concrete or other built forms. They can build it today at costs that are significantly lower than conventional construction. There are barriers to that, the vertical integration of development with those manufacturers. Financing product availability that's conducive to an inventory type financing that is just not common in housing. So there's a bunch of innovation that has to happen across that spectrum. Building Ontario Fund is going to play by mandate on the more investable side of that, but that doesn't mean we can't have a significant impact in the structural cost of housing, and quite intend to.
I'll just give a shameless plug for my own work. I did interview one of the developers who's working on a modular solution for this is what they call the missing middle, so more like 4 stories or smaller than mid-rise, and people can go to TVO.org to check that out. I'm going to put this to Scott and Laura, because we seem to allude to earlier that maybe we have reached a détente, a peace settlement with the DC debate, that developers and municipalities, as you said with Bill 17, are not as far apart as they may have once appeared. So, I mean, is that debate over, Scott?
I think it's a healthy conversation that's going to continue, because the challenges are going to continue to evolve. But again, I think at the core of this was education. From our side, on the builder side, we understood a lot better after sitting down and going back and forth on things, understanding the current challenges that municipalities are facing. And one of the things when you talk about DCs, the concern was if it's not being paid by the developers and ultimately by the home buyers, then it's going to go into the property tax base. So they're concerned about those costs that ultimately find their way to the tax base. What municipalities, I think is fair to say, that they learned was on the builder side, it's not just about, oh, well, the builder will pay for that. The builder doesn't pay for that. The builder absorbs that cost, and then it gets passed on to what the sticker price is ultimately on a new home or a new condo. And by having that better understanding, we're both protecting our end customer. Municipalities are protecting the ratepayer, builders are protecting the home buyer. So we want to figure out where some of those costs need to go. And here's where we really agreed. We really agreed that the other two levels of government really needed to step up and start putting more money into infrastructure. Because when you look at Ontario, first off, most highly regulated province when it comes to home construction in all of Canada. A lot of the challenges we're facing here, not even BC doesn't have the same level of difficulty and challenges that Ontario has. Second thing is that the Ontario government contributes the least amount to municipal infrastructure compared to every other province. PEI on a per capita per house basis contributes more to municipal infrastructure than the Ontario government. So that just does not work. Because when you sit around and you've got every province sitting around the table, whether it be government folks, whether it be builders, whether it be municipalities, they always look to see, they lean forward to see what Ontario's going to do first. Ontario just is one of those leaders. It's the largest populace in the province or in the country. It is one where we have a lot of the most complex challenges to overcome. So they look to see what Ontario does, and then that tends to open the floodgates and lead, which is why I want the Premier to step up and say, let Ontario go first, and we will take the PST portion of HST off of new home sales. But when we figured out what our common ground was, and then we focused together on how to do that. Not only did we see Bill 17 and all the things that are coming with that, we saw yesterday $1.6 billion of additional money the province has announced into infrastructure. Our message is getting through. Our message is much stronger when it's combined. And when we're saying the same things, it's harder for the province then to wedge municipalities and developers on common issues.
Laura, anything you want to add?
I'm glad Scott said that, not me. Yeah, that's right. We did learn about each other, and municipalities and municipal councillors, obviously, we cannot transfer the costs of growth onto existing taxpayers. We've had a long-standing policy in this province, or idea, that growth should pay for growth. People complain about NIMBYism. Well, NIMBYism gets much stronger when people think that they have to pay for the infrastructure, the cost of the infrastructure for new communities as well. So it's really important that we have a mechanism where growth is paying for growth. And that doesn't have to be development charges, but if it's not going to be development charges, then it really has to be senior levels of government using their fiscal tools to provide transfer payments to municipalities. That becomes dollar-for-dollar reductions out of development charges, and then that relieves the ultimate homeowners from those costs.
Let me pose a bit of a provocation to you, and I'm speaking with, and I'm going to be anonymous about this, but I was speaking with a member of parliament a while back who said that he felt that municipalities were being greedy, that between the provincial and federal orders of government in the last few years, huge sums of money have been made available. The Premier just announced it's now a $4 billion infrastructure fund. And now that's $4 billion over 4 years, I believe, so it's $1 billion a year. But this, again, a federal member of parliament said to me that municipalities were being greedy, that with the sums that have been made available in the last few years, actually development charges should be pretty close to zero at this point. I'm going to assume that you disagree with that statement, and maybe you'd like to explain why.
Sure, and I'll go back to using the example of my own municipality, but I'll start with this. Infrastructure, particularly housing enabling infrastructure, water and sewer, treatment, it's very expensive infrastructure. York Region is planning on building about $12 billion worth of capital over the next 10 years. 8 of that is to either enable growth, so water and sewer, or make our communities livable. Roads, transit, police, paramedics, and then local municipalities have their own infrastructure as well. So it's very, very expensive. So to put the provincial money in context, that wouldn't even pay for half of the growth-related infrastructure in the region of York. So it's being spread over 444 municipalities, and I have yet to meet a colleague in the municipal sector that is trying to waste either their own taxpayers' dollars or the provincial or federal money. We are trying to put various sources of funding together so that we can build the infrastructure at scale and at a timing when it's required, so that the builders can get on with the job of building homes for people.
So, Michael, we've got this issue where, the homes need infrastructure, the infrastructure needs money. What is the solution here? Is there an easy one? No.
And go.
And we both look at Michael.
Yeah, here we go.
You got 2 minutes, go.
Yeah, in a funding sandwich up here. So, look, I think the thing I would remind everyone, though, is that funding that comes from the government comes from all 444 municipalities, right? They're just coming from the tax. It's coming from the tax base. It's just a bigger one than the municipal tax base. And so the idea that the province starts funding infrastructure at some more grand scale is really a redistribution question across those 444 municipalities, of which there are many represented here. And so I think the question or the ideological debate is whether that cost burden should be borne where the growth is or borne more broadly. And so what I'm getting at is the money's all borrowed, and it's all borrowed on the same tax base, no matter what level of government it comes from. So now there is a debate to be had around who's got the most capital efficiency, right? Who has the lowest borrowing rates? Who can borrow at a scale that allows this type of work to move forward? And as an example, Infrastructure Ontario has a municipal loans program that passes through the provincial cost of borrowing at an insignificant margin through to municipalities to enable just this type of thing. And so there are programs that do pass that borrowing capacity through, but I think it behooves us all to think about where the most efficient source of capital is. And to earlier points, it's probably not from the private sector at a 17% discount rate. And so I don't have a solution to solve all infrastructure problems. But I think that the dialogue that's ongoing and well-timed housing crises push solutions. And so if there's a silver lining to the challenges in housing now, it's the prevalence of innovation and discussions around productivity enhancements and novel models coming through our front door to try and bring the cost of housing down because it has to, or otherwise it's not economic. So, there's a bit of a renaissance in really creative thinking out there that we're seeing, and it's actually quite exciting. But there's no silver bullet here, and there's no magic pot of money that isn't ultimately derived from the tax base, just a bigger one or a smaller one.
Well, the other issue is one of the big ideas that is floating around out there that the minister alluded to in his speech yesterday is like a municipal services corporation for, they're looking at specifically water and sewer infrastructure in Peel region. I mean, Laura, for York region, is the water on the rate base, or is it on, do you have a service corporation?
We don't have a municipal service corporation, but we do have a water and sewer wholesale. So we do treatment of water and wastewater, and we sell water to our local municipalities, and then they have a retail relationship with their ratepayers.
And so are you paying attention to this question of the Municipal Service Corporation? Do you see that as a potential way forward for that housing enabling infrastructure?
Yeah, what I would say is that we're really looking forward to see what the province does with this pilot project with Peel region. We know that they are in the midst of consultations right now, and as I said before, we do share the same goals. Right? We want to be able to build infrastructure where it's required as economically as possible, and if this is a way to do that, we stand ready to work with the province to explore it.
Casting our eyes more broadly, we've talked a lot about the GTA, the GTHA. Scott, in terms of the solutions we've discussed, how many of these can be replicated beyond the GTA region?
Well, I think that if we break it down, one of the things that we learned out of this, and one of the things that builders have been saying for a while, is that we understand how to build houses. We understand how to build them efficiently and cost effectively. It's when other things get added on, and when you take all three levels of government in terms of their fees and taxes, they're now totaling about 30 to 35% of the cost of a new home. And so when governments are saying we need to do more about making housing more affordable, then we need to start with that. And one of the things I think that came out of the collaboration between municipalities and the builders is that municipalities understood a little bit more on how we try to focus on making our building most efficient and most effective, so that we can actually deliver homes at as close to prices that people can afford as we possibly can in the environment. But here's what we learned from the builder side in dealing with municipalities. And I feel I can say this with a little bit of confidence, because in one of my previous lives, I actually worked with Brian in one of his iterations of working with AMO. So I did have that view of the municipal lens. And one of the things that's always been clear to me, and just reinforced by working with folks like Laura and others, is that municipalities are also really good at what they do, and they understand what the costs are to deliver infrastructure. It's not their fault infrastructure costs are as high as they are. And sometimes when governments or the public think that, municipalities, to your point about they're greedy and they're just looking for ways to pay for different things, that is not the case. So we sympathize with municipalities when you see the province that tries to shoehorn them into a model that may not work for everywhere. So it may work in the GTA, but may not work elsewhere. I am getting to the answer to your question. But most importantly, we have another level of government come along to you as municipalities and say, we're going to introduce a completely different regime of things where we're going to ask you to sign this agreement in exchange for money to do something completely different that is probably not aligned with what the province is doing. It's not effective, it's not aligned, and it's not fair for you. At the end of the day, you are frontline with your ratepayers. We are frontline with our home buyers. So we take a lot of the discussion is about the problems in the GTA. We have way too many 1 and 1+ bedroom condos because a certain city, starts with T, thought they were more market savvy than builders in terms of understanding their customers. Families wanting to live in downtown because they don't want to have to commute cannot put a 4-member family in a 1+1 bedroom condo. It does not work. So we have this glut that is not working. In the rural areas, it is really more about infrastructure. It is about how do you get that pipe into a community that just does not have one. So when I hear the province say, we will give you money, but you have to agree to make housing your focus in terms of council, hence sometimes why they extend that strong mayor power. Okay, maybe that will work. But what we're doing is trying to figure out how do we work closely with municipalities to make sure that the solution that's required actually works. And to Laura's point, sitting down with the developers and the builders is the way you figure out what that is.
And Michael, it is the Building Ontario Fund, not the Building GTA Fund. I mean, how are conditions different outside of the GTA? How does that inform your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we often get focused on the markets that draw the news and the stories, which certainly is the GTA these days. But the housing issues are completely different, for example, in the north. Supply of housing, just generally speaking, is a challenge across many northern municipalities. I mean, I've spoke to many here at the conference just over the past few days, and generally not viewed as an investable, a place that draws investment, and not in any individual community at a scale that would abide by the normal financial rules that we would see in the GTA. Now, if we're serious about capitalizing on things like critical minerals and natural resources, there better be a place for those people to live. And so housing in the north really needs to be a focus for all of our policies, and it's certainly a place thanks for that. But yeah, in all seriousness, we need to have solutions for the north, and our mandate certainly extends to that, and we have every intention on enabling housing outside of the markets that get most of the attention.
So I'm going to wrap us up soon here, but we've got a provincial and a federal environment where the focus is overwhelmingly on confronting Donald Trump and more national economic questions. And so I think the obvious question is, how do we get those other levels of government, the ones who are not represented by AMO, to really bring the focus to housing either as part of that economic battle or as a separate one that's just as important. And Laura, I will go to you first. I mean, what's your play?
So housing requires infrastructure, and communities require funding to build that infrastructure. And if we want to reduce the burden on the ultimate homeowner, the best thing that both the federal and provincial government could do is to invest in housing enabling infrastructure across all of our communities. That will create the conditions for the private sector to build the housing we need.
Michael.
I'll pick up on something Scott said earlier, which is around market confidence. I think the Trump discussion and the tariff discussion is going to suck up the air in the room for the foreseeable future. But it's confidence coming from an economic direction that ultimately feeds the sentiment of buyers and then ultimately the sentiment of developers that will drag along infrastructure and other programs with it, and the need for those things. So changing the channel to what the economic future for Canada, but also of course Ontario, looks like, and making sure that's a resilient and diversified future. This sounds very high level, of course, but there's a market confidence problem triggered by all of this, and discourse needs to address that to help put a bit of air back into the market.
And Scott, last word to you.
I think I would call it just that focus on education and understanding. So I think the outcome of our little experiment that started earlier this year of putting municipalities and builders in the same room and better understanding the challenges that each of us have, then we figure out, okay, we always thought this, now we understand that it's different, so we could change this, align this, modify this on both sides. And then the province is sitting there watching, okay, they're working together, and one of the best things we heard coming out of Minister Flack and by extension the Premier is that we really do need to figure out not only how to get out of your way as municipalities and builders to get those homes built, but also to hold our level of government across all the ministries, all the former silos, to be able to hold them accountable so that they follow suit. It can't just be municipal affairs and housing is the only way that this will get solved. It's across all of government.
Okay. And a round of applause for the whole panel, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.